Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the second edition of the webinar series on space sustainability. Space sustainability is not just a buzzword, as we know, or a buzz concept. It has actually become critical for reliable space applications on Earth. And as you're aware, even reliable access to space and space operations ensure that we continue to derive benefits from space. However, a growing number of countries are developing and testing anti-satellite and counter-space capabilities, which threaten the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and the ability to use space by everyone. So today we'll be discussing the threat from anti-satellites and what to do about them. Our facilitator is Dr. Weeden, who is the Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation. You already read about his bio when you were registering for the course, so I will save time by not going through that again. But suffice it to say that the Secure World Foundation is at the forefront of efforts to strengthen space sustainability and global space governance. And Dr. Weeden is one of those that is leading these efforts. But before Dr. Weeden comes up to give lecture, I'll just say a few words about ASLI, the host of this event, the ASLI. So for those of us who have access to the African space policy and strategy, if you look at that document, which is actually available online, there are two policy goals in that document. One is to create a well-coordinated and integrated African space program that is responsive to the social, economic, political, and environmental needs of the continent, as well as being globally competitive. The second goal is to develop a regulatory framework that supports an African space program and ensures that Africa is a responsible and peaceful user of outer space. And actually, the second goal mainly is the rationale or the reason for this webinar series. We had the first one sometime last month where we focused on the use of lasers in space. Today we are focusing on ASATs, and then the next one we'll be talking about governance of military activities, and I'll explain why we are actually doing that later on. So the ASLI was conceptualized because we observed that there are a lot of gaps when it comes to space policy, space law, space governance within the continent, and even at the leadership level also. So as far back as 2018, we had thought of a think tank or an institute which will focus on this area and try to fill the gaps in this area. So this paper which we wrote, that was published 2018, it's available online. It's actually the guide or the compass to what we are doing right now. The institute itself was properly registered in July last year. It's registered in South Africa, but we made a public presentation in October last year. And since then, we've been having a couple of activities since October last year. So we are barely 5 months old. So in terms of mission, you can see the activities of ASLI from two perspectives. One is to support current space leaders. What do space leaders do? Majorly to make policy, to make decisions. So we want to support Africans, especially African communities, African nations, African leaders in organizations when it comes to policy making, because we believe that when you have the appropriate policies in place, then other things will take shape, and the outcome or the output will likely be very predictable. So to assist in policy making and also in policy implementation, and then also to support in decision making, also specific decisions that need to be made from time to time. We're also interested in space strategy, both at the national level, also at the firm level, And even when it comes to issues of defense and national security, we also want to support African governments in that aspect too. And of course, when it comes to space governance also, which is partly this webinar is connected to that. Space law is a bit more popular in Africa. There are a few countries, a few institutions, like in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Pretoria, South Africa, that run programs on space law specifically, that's focusing on the Outer Space Treaty. But when it comes to the broader space governance as a whole, there is not much knowledge, there's not much interest in that. So we also want to fill in that gap at the national level, and not only at the national level, but when it comes to specific thematic areas, Earth observation, that's geospatial policy and law, satellite communications, like issues of frequency, spectrum management, navigation and positioning, even astronomy. The issue, one of the issues going on right now is the issues between the dark skies debate, how mega constellations are disrupting astronomical observations. So we want to also assist African countries in that, and of course play the role of a think tank. And you know what a think tank does? Basically to bring experts together to think on an issue and then to advise. So we support current African space leaders, but also, or maybe more importantly, is to develop future space leaders. So we are planning educational programs, courses that young people who are interested can participate in, and opportunities for volunteering. Right now, we have about 3 or 4 volunteers that are supporting the things we are doing. You know, we don't have funds right now, so we work using volunteers. Also create opportunities for internships and fellowships. So in terms of service offerings, we are going to focus on capacity building in every way possible. Also try and promote African agenda, especially at international fora. Some of us are aware that CONFERS is going on right now. One of the things we want to do is to support Africans in trying to take positions at the national level, at the continental level. In terms of specifics, we are going to organize webinars, seminars, conferences, training courses, dialogues, symposia, and of course, do research and publications. Some of these things we've already started. So like I mentioned, we've already started some of these programs, like the policy talks, which I anchor. We have averagely 1 or 2 every month. We've done 4, as you can see here. And the idea about the policy talks is to bring leaders, both African and international space leaders, to come and discuss on any issue of interest, and then we try and delve into see how does it affect Africa and how should Africa respond to it. Another program we've done one is the Space Policy Roundtable. We did one December last year. You may remember that President Biden invited African leaders to the US-Africa Space Summit. And so in view of that, we felt that space should be a component of that discussion. So that was why we organized this roundtable, and we brought experts from the US side and the African side for discussion. Some of these spaces are familiar. And there was a lot of acceptance and endorsement. In fact, the US ambassador to South Africa gave a keynote address, and the African Union Commissioner to also gave a keynote address. You can see some familiar spaces like Professor Scott Pace, T.D. Anotara from the AUC, Val Musami, the Chancellor of International Space University. One of the values of ASLI, one of our values is accountability. And when we talk about accountability, it's not only within the organization, we want to take it outside to Africa. We want to hold our leaders accountable. So if you make a decision, why did you make that decision? You need to explain to us and tell us maybe the pros and cons. I mean, how you got to that decision. So we've done one of that. After the US-Africa Space Leaders Summit last year, we invited 2 African delegates who were part of that, who attended that meeting, to come and share, the deliberations at that meeting and the outcome of that meeting. So we hope to have more of this. For example, CONFERS is going on right now. We are hoping that we can get some people to give us a feedback of the deliberations that went on during the S&T meeting and then what to look out for. So our upcoming events, we still plan to have more policy talks. The next policy talk is on March 8th, and we are bringing Adrian from South Africa. He's into astronomy. Most of this information you will see it either on our website or if you follow us on LinkedIn or other social media platforms. So the policy talks once or twice a month, and then the space policy roundtables, that is quarterly. The next roundtable is on 7th of March, and we want to discuss small satellite development within Africa. Our major interest or flagship program is education, is the courses. We are starting off with the space policy course very strongly. That's going to start on April 6th, and we have a very good and expert faculty from all over the world, not just Africa. More information on that will also be available online. We actually have plans for other courses, African space policy and strategy, law and governance, developing the ecosystem, international cooperation. Our focus is not on engineering, it's not on the technical side, it's non-technical. So we want to fill the gap on the non-technical side. We leave universities to handle the technical angles. We also plan to have more webinars. Many thanks to Dr. Weeden for this. The next webinar is going to be on March 1st. And I think for the first time after the release of the Milamos manual, Professor Ramjakul agreed to facilitate, he and the team, some of the members of the team, to facilitate a webinar on the Milamos manual. So that's going to be on the 1st of March. The announcement will come online very soon. Have more of the view from the sites, holding more African leaders more accountable. And then, of course, book talks. We actually have a book talk coming up towards the end of March, but I've not confirmed the date. So those are some of the things we plan to do. I omitted a colloquium. We plan to have a colloquium possibly in November this year. And the idea is also to promote scholarly work when it comes to the African outer space program or ecosystem as a whole. So we plan to have a colloquium sometime in November. So I think that's just a brief about the ASLI. If there's any question, we can discuss that later. For now, I think our focus is on ASAT, and I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Brian Weeden to continue to take over from here. So, Dr. Brian Weeden, you have the floor, please.
Great, thank you very much for that. And if you could enable me to present, I will go ahead and bring up my slides. In the meantime, hello everyone. It's great to be here today. I hope through this webinar, you're going to pick up on a couple of things. One is why this issue of anti-satellite weapons testing and counter-space capabilities is critical to space sustainability, which Etienne mentioned in the beginning is a major focus of the work of ASLI. And second, why this is a topic that everyone needs to have a say in and participate in, not just the major space powers. So hopefully everybody can go ahead and see my screen. I've got about 35-40 minutes of slides here. We very much hope to have enough time left over to have a discussion. If there are questions that come up while I'm talking, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom or drop a message in the chat, and I will attempt to answer those as we go along. So I'm going to just give a quick background on Secure World. We're going to talk about what we mean by this term counter space capabilities, the history of these. They're not new. This stuff has been around for decades, and it's only sort of becoming back again. And then we're going to talk about what's going on in the multilateral UN discussions to deal with these weapons and these questions. and then some of the things that are still open challenges. For those that have not heard of us before, Secure World Foundation is a privately funded operating foundation that is based here in the United States, although we do a lot of international work. Our focus is the secure, sustainable, peaceful uses of outer space that contribute to global stability on Earth. So we deal with everything from space debris and space traffic management to conflict in outer space, and how we can continue to make space sustainable and use it for benefits here on Earth. And we work with a lot of different governments. We work with industry. We work with different international organizations to help promote ideas and actions to achieve this end. So why this thing called counterspace? Why is this something that countries are focusing on and putting efforts into? Well, you know, from the very early days that we developed space capabilities back in the 1950s, countries were looking at how do we develop counter space capabilities? And those would be things you could use to deny someone else's use of space in a conflict, or that would be using their space against you. And so, for example, very early on, the United States and Soviet Union were looking at using satellites to collect imagery, to collect intelligence. They were looking at satellites and missiles to deliver nuclear weapons. And they were also looking at how do we create capabilities to prevent someone else from using a satellite against us. Counterspace can take the form of defensive counterspace, in order of defending your own satellites, offensive counterspace, doing something against somebody else's satellites, and then this concept called space situational awareness, which is knowing what's going on in space, sort of knowledge of what's happening. When we talk about counterspace, we talk about 6 specific categories, and I'm going to give some examples of each of these here in a minute. And these again have been around for decades. There are some different ways to think about this, but this is the way that we usually talk about this. There's something called direct ascent, and these are weapons that are launched with missiles from the ground or from aircraft or from ships, and the weapon goes up into space and destroys satellites by colliding with it. But the weapons are not placed into orbit themselves. If they happen to miss their target, they would end up coming right back down and re-entering the atmosphere. By contrast, something called co-orbital are weapons that are placed into orbit. So these are satellites themselves that are placed into orbit, and then they change their orbit to approach a target, and they attack it by multiple different ways, both destructive and non-destructive. Directed energy, these are weapons that use lasers, particle, microwave beams to interfere with or destroy systems, and most of them actually don't destroy. Most of them are more of an interference type of weapon. Electronic warfare, these are weapons that use radio frequency energy to interfere with or jam with the communications to or from satellites. Cyber weapons are those that go after the software or go after the command and control computers or the networks. And then finally, space situational awareness, as I mentioned, this is a broad set of capability about how do we know what's in space. And this is something that is done for a lot of purposes, peaceful purposes, it's done for safety reasons, but you have to have space situational awareness to know what's in space to either target something or to defend your own satellite. So we consider it part of counterspace. So a couple of examples. On the left is a direct ascent counter space weapon that was developed to be launched from an American F-15 fighter jet. It was tested in the mid-1980s. So the plane would fly up to a very high altitude, release this rocket, essentially. The rocket would boost the what we call a kinetic kill vehicle, which would then go up and collide with a satellite. And this was successfully tested in 1985. On the right is an example of a ground-launched one. This is a missile that is launched from a ground platform, and at the very, very top of it, just a little upper bit of that cone is the actual kinetic kill vehicle, which again goes up and collides with the satellite. And this was what India tested in 2019. They used this exact missile and this system. As far as co-orbital, there's only ever been one system that we know about that was a co-orbital weapon, and it was this Soviet Intra-Sputnik program. You can see an image of it on the left as it's sitting in a factory getting ready to be assembled, and there's another more modern version of it on the right. On the very left of these photos, you can see this big radar antenna. That was what was used by the satellite to find the satellite it was going after, and then it would use you can see the metal tanks in the middle and the thrusters, and it would use those to change its orbit to get close to another satellite. And then the black and white boxes, those were explosives. So this is almost like a grenade in space. It would get close to the satellite, and then it would explode. And the hope was that the shrapnel from the explosion would damage the target satellite. Directed energy, a lot of this is ground-based because the lasers take up a lot of power, and it's still a newer technology. On the left top, you can see a laser, what are called the Russian Peresvet system. It's mounted on a truck, and it's used. The laser is not powerful enough to destroy satellites, but it's sort of like shining a flashlight in someone's eyes. It's powerful enough to dazzle the cameras on the satellite to prevent them from being able to take a picture. And the same thing with the one on the bottom. This is a similar laser system mounted on an aircraft called an A60. And on the right is a much bigger laser setup located in China. And what these buildings that are pointed out, the roof of these buildings can slide back. And if they did, you would see there'd be a giant telescope there. And one of those telescopes is the laser itself. As far as electronic warfare, this is probably the most popular type of counterspace capability because it's relatively easy to do. And if you can interfere with the communications to a satellite, then that satellite might as well not even exist. It can't take pictures. It can't communicate the pictures. It can't relay signals. It's very difficult. It's pretty much useless. And this is much cheaper to do. On the left, these are some Russian military electronic warfare systems, R-330ZH, ZTELs, Tirada 2s that were imaged near the Luhansk region of Ukraine in 2019. These are the kind of systems where they can deploy them and they will interfere with GPS in an area of maybe 10 kilometers or so. So that inside of that bubble, there's no GPS signals or they're very difficult to get. On the right is the example of the only publicly known US counterspace system or anti-satellite system. And something called the counter communication system. It is essentially a large satellite dish that can be deployed in theater, and they can use signals from this dish to interfere with satellites. So there's a question in the chat. Is it legal to mount direct energy weapons on satellites to dazzle other satellite sensors? The short answer is yes. There is no international law prohibiting placement of weapons in space or mounting weapons on satellites, except if those weapons are nuclear weapons. So you cannot orbit a nuclear weapon. You cannot attach a nuclear weapon to a satellite. but all other kinds of weapons are permissible under international law. And what's really complicated here is there are some technologies that are not designed to be weapons, but could be used for weapons effects. So, for example, LiDAR, which is a laser ranging system, is pretty commonly used for docking or approaching another satellite, just like LiDAR is used on cars as part of autonomous driving or even safety driving. But, you know, a LiDAR system is still emitting a laser beam, and if that is aimed in the right direction, and if it is, you know, aimed at a sensor on a satellite that is sensitive enough, it could, again, be like shining a flashlight in their eyes, and it could dazzle something. So very, very difficult to control and to prohibit this kind of technology, as we'll talk about towards the end here. Cyber capabilities are much harder to detect because they're just computer systems, right? And people don't talk about them. They're harder to see. But on the very first day of the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine that happened back in last February, there was a very big cyber attack against a satellite company called Viasat. Viasat operates geostationary satellites that provide communications, and this attack broke thousands of Viasat modems that were being used on the ground to receive those signals and be communication. It's almost like your internet modem, right? Someone hacked into Viasat's ground network and delivered a malicious software update that affected, you know, thousands of these terminals all across Europe and made them unworkable. And a couple of months later, both the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union publicly attributed this attack to Russia, coming from the GRU's military cyber capabilities, and it was done because the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military was using Viasat for communications, and so they disabled the system in order to, on the first day of the war, to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to communicate. Now, the satellite is perfectly fine. The satellite is still broadcasting. The problem was that no one in Europe could receive those satellite signals because they disabled the modems. One more example here, and that is of different kinds of space situation awareness sensors. On the left, you see a very large phased array tracking radar that is operated by the United Kingdom in a place called Fylingdales. On the right, you see a set of large telescopes operated by Russia at a place called Okno, which I think is actually in Tajikistan. And on the bottom, you see a satellite operated by the US military called the Space-Based Space Surveillance Satellite that has a large telescope on it. These are all examples of large, powerful systems operated by militaries that can be used to track things in space. It is also possible to track things in space in your backyard using a telescope, or in some cases even binoculars. So there's a wide range of different capabilities. This is something that lots of countries do. This is something that astronomers do. This is something that universities and sometimes even hobbyists do, is track things in space and detect things in space. And again, there's a lot of peaceful uses for this. I'm going to get to the question there about the legality of this when we talk about that towards the end, because I think it's a really good example of one of the challenges that we're going to talk about. So who is doing what? This comes from an annual report that my organization puts out where we talk about all the different countries and what they're doing. US, Russia, and China are all developing, or in the past have developed, all of these capabilities: co-orbital, direct descent, directed energy, electronic warfare, and space situational awareness. So you can say they are sort of the leading candidates here in terms of developing these capabilities. India has also tested a direct descent weapon by destroying one of its own satellites. So that would kind of put them in the the fourth position, if you'd want. The other countries listed here: Australia, France, Iran, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom, all of them are developing at least some space situation awareness capabilities. All of them are developing or are using electronic warfare capabilities. And some of them are exploring direct energy. So the most popular and the most widespread is the electronic warfare, the jamming, as well as space situation awareness. As I mentioned, the testing and development of these capabilities is not new. This chart shows the history of anti-satellite testing by country and by year. And you can see the very first test was done by the United States in 1959. All of the blue are tests done by the United States. All of the red are tests done by the Soviet Union or Russia. And you can see that between 1959 and 1995, there were about 50 tests that were done as part of the Cold War arms race between the United States and Soviet Union. Then there was a period of time between 1995 and 2005 when no one was testing anti-satellite weapons. But since 2005, there have been more than 20 tests, most of them by China and by Russia, although there was also a test by the United States, and of course the test by India in 2019 that I mentioned. So part of our concern is that this renewed focus is going to spread to more countries, and more countries are going to be doing this kinds of testing. Where do we stand on how does the global community, how does the United Nations address the threat posed by the development and the use of these weapons? Unfortunately, there has not been a lot of progress on this. The United Nations, through the Conference on Disarmament, which is located in Geneva, has been talking about what they call the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or PAROS, since the 1980s. But for different reasons, different countries have been blocking or have been sort of resisting this progress going forward. In many cases, this has been the United States, but there have also been other countries that have blocked it at different times for different reasons. There is a large amount of disagreement between countries on what the specific threats are and how to address them. Since 2008, Russia and China have been pushing what they call the Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, or the PPWT, and more recently are urging for a pledge for no first placement of weapons in outer space. The problem is both of these agreements only deal with co-orbital anti-satellite weapons that are placed into orbit. The PPWT would allow for ground-based direct descent ASAT weapons, lasers. All of those would be legal under the PPWT, and so it would only address a certain part of the problem, and it's really designed to make illegal a future U.S. space-based missile defense program, which the US is not developing. On the other hand, while the United States and the Western countries have fought against the PPWT, they have not offered any alternative treaties or any alternative suggestions up until very recently. In 2020, there was a UN General Assembly resolution supported by the United Kingdom, but had a lot of other countries supporting it, that called on countries to talk about and express what they felt were threats in space and responsible, irresponsible behavior and possible paths forward. And this link over here, and I can send you a link. I can actually drop it into the chat here. Goes to all the summaries that were submitted by more than 30 countries and some NGOs on this. Countries highlighted harmful interference, the close approaches, the creation of long-lived debris. In December 2021, the UN General Assembly passed another resolution that created an open-ended working group that would meet 4 times, 2022 and 2023, to develop recommendations on norms, rules, principles, responsible behavior for dealing with space threats. And this open-ended working group is currently the main place where these discussions are happening. They have met 3 times so far, and are due to meet once more in August of later this year. The good news is that because this is an open-ended working group, that means as many countries as would like to can participate. And in fact, I was just at the most recent one that was held a couple of weeks ago in Geneva. There were, I think, at least 60 countries there, including several African countries, a lot of Latin American countries. Countries like the Philippines were very active. And it was very good to see that this discussion was not just between the powers of, the space powers of US, Russia, and China. Civil society is also able to participate. You can see in the photo here, my colleague Victoria Sampson is on a panel talking about our perspectives on this. In fact, that report I mentioned, we handed copies of that to all the delegations because we talk about what all the different countries are doing. And my organization has also been holding some regional workshops. We did one in Korea, we did one in Chile. We're thinking about doing one in Africa in the near future to help countries better understand these issues and then be able to contribute to the working group. So what has emerged from the working group and also my organization is focusing on is the testing of direct ascent ASAT weapons. We feel is the most critical, the most important issue to deal with at this moment. And that is because using these weapons against a satellite, destroying that satellite, creates lots of orbital debris that stays up there and poses a hazard for a lot of countries. As I mentioned earlier, between 59 and 95, the US and Soviet Union did more than a dozen destructive tests that created more than 1,200 pieces of orbital debris. 400 of those are still on orbit 2, 3, 4 decades later. Since 2005, US, Russia, China, India have done 5 destructive tests, creating more than 5,000 pieces of debris bigger than a softball, bigger than 10 centimeters. And a lot of that is still on orbit. You can see this chart is data compiled from a year ago. We're currently working on a new version of this, but you could see, the test that China did in 2007, there's more than 2,700 pieces of debris still on orbit today, from that test that was done 15 years ago. And there's more than 1,000 pieces of debris on orbit from the test that Russia did in November of 2021. So this is why we think this is the biggest issue, because when you do these kinds of tests, it affects everybody. And it's not just, even if you do the test at a very low altitude, debris still goes everywhere. So on the left is an example of the US destroyed one of its own satellites in 2008 at an altitude of 220 kilometers. And in a second here, you're going to see, after that destruction, all of these red and green and blue dots, these are pieces of debris that got thrown as high as 2,000 kilometers, much, much higher than the test originally altitude. But because when the satellite exploded, this debris got pushed everywhere. And you can see these dots in the middle are the International Space Station, the Tiangong, the Chinese space station, and the Starlink constellation. This debris is all coming down past all these space stations and posing a threat. And this debris kept coming down for 18 months after the test happened, even though it was a relatively low test. And on the right, you can see the same thing with Mission Shakti, which was the Indian ASAT test. So this is all the debris that was created by the Indian ASAT test, again, got thrown much higher than the test altitude of 300 kilometers, and it's all slowly coming down over time. So the most recent thing that's happened is there's a growing support for a voluntary moratorium on these kinds of destructive tests. In last April, the United States, Vice President Harris announced they were putting in place a voluntary moratorium on destructive testing. In other words, the United States was saying, we pledge we are no longer going to test these kinds of weapons. So far, 10 other countries have announced similar pledges: New Zealand, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, Switzerland, Australia, and France. Last December, so just a couple of months ago, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly passed a resolution supporting this and calling on more countries to announce moratoriums. This is an example of the vote. There were more than 150 countries that voted in support of this moratorium on ASAT testing. Only 9 countries voted against: China, Iran, Russia, Syria, Belarus, Bolivia, CAR, a couple others, and there were 7 countries that abstained, including India. So right now, this has a lot of momentum behind it. So I'm going to conclude here just by talking about some of the open challenges. Part of the reason this is difficult is the countries developing and testing these weapons, US, Russia, China, India, are doing them for different reasons. They all say they have a reason, a military reason, a national security reason to develop these capabilities. And so there's no one argument that we can get at to convince them otherwise. There are links between space arms control, missile defense, nuclear stability, nuclear deterrence, that makes it very difficult to deal with one of those questions without dealing with the others. As we've been talking about here in the chat, and I'll get back to the second part of this question in a minute, there are challenges in defining what a space weapon is. If I have a LiDAR sensor on my satellite that I need to dock with another satellite, but I can turn that or use that as a weapon, how do I control that technology? Similar we've seen here, in wars here on the ground where people turn cars into weapons or other types of things. It makes it very difficult to define what this is and control it. And this is why there's been a shift from in Paros talking about banning or prohibiting technologies or different types of satellites to controlling actions and behavior. So what countries do or how countries use things, because the actions, behaviors are easier to define and easier to observe. They're easier to verify. And that gets to the last element here is, if we're going to go from this moratorium, a voluntary moratorium, to some kind of a treaty or a prohibition, a legal prohibition, one of the big questions is, how would you verify that? How would you verify that countries are following it? How would you verify that countries are not violating it? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. One last thing before I get to the discussion with the time we have left. My organization is planning our 5th Summit for Space Sustainability. It'll be in New York City, June 13th and 14th. We will be talking about this issue of anti-satellite testing, how it relates to space sustainability. While main conference is going to be in person, we are going to stream it. There's going to be a hybrid option. There are student ticket prices that are available, which are really reasonable. I think $25, something like that, or $50, pretty reasonable. Please, you can go to swfsummit.org and you can find more information and you can register there. So I'm more than happy to talk about anything that I mentioned, answer any follow-ups. And for the question in the chat, the question was, when satellites with lasers that are not meant, that are used for something else, is it still legal? I don't know. So there is an existing, inside the United Nations Charter, there is a prohibition on use of force and armed attack against other countries. And that still applies in space as it does here on Earth. But of course, here on Earth, we've seen many instances of countries that have violated that have attacked other countries. So I would say, yes, it is just as illegal in space as it is on Earth, but there's a lot of questions about what degree of what amounts to a use of force. If I just dazzle a satellite, is that an armed attack? Is that a use of force? If I destroy the satellite, is that an armed attack? Is that a use of force? There are people working on trying to figure out those questions, but that's uncertain at the moment. So there's a question here about dichotomy between sustainability and space security. Are they actually separate? Are they very similar? My organization, we feel that space security is part of space sustainability. And that's because there are actions like destroying satellites that create debris and have a huge impact on space sustainability. They threaten everyone's satellites. Now, there are other types of weapons, of counterspace capabilities that do not necessarily have an impact on space sustainability. So, for example, that cyber attack against Viasat, the satellite was perfectly fine. The satellite was perfectly operational. There was that cyber attack did not have a negative impact on space sustainability or on the space environment. It did have an impact on using that on collecting the data on the Earth. So there are some types of security weapons uses that have strong impacts on sustainability, some that do not. As far as the synergy between COPUOS and the UN Open-Ended Working Group, that is a complicated question. There are a lot of countries that would like to keep the work of COPUOS on peaceful uses separate from the work of the the Conference on Disarmament and the OAWG on security. And that is because the security issues are much more contentious. And there's a fear that if security flows over to COPUOS, then all the work in COPUOS stops. This is the work on long-term sustainability, the work on orbital debris, things that have been able to see progress in the last 5 or 10 years. There's a concern that bringing security into that is going to stop that progress. But it's very difficult to not talk about them. Testing anti-satellite weapons creates debris. We talk about debris in UN COPUOS. So there's a bit of a link there. Finally, for the ASEAN member states to join the ASAT moratorium, I think it's very important for every country that cares about this to join the moratorium. The more countries that join the moratorium, the stronger the international norm becomes that this kind of testing is irresponsible and should be eventually made illegal. So I think the more countries that support the moratorium, the stronger the case there will be for a legally binding treaty reinforcing that commitment down the road. So yes, I think more should be involved in that. There's a question here about the administrator of NASA, Bill Nelson's concern that the space race. I would say you need to interpret Bill Nelson's comments based on his audience. He is primarily making those arguments and those comments aimed at the United States Congress to convince the Congress to support NASA and in some cases even to increase funding for NASA. There's a lot of concern in the United States about China's growing space program, about China potentially presenting a threat to the United States, the competition between the US and China. And so Administrator Nelson sees that China competition angle as perhaps the best way to get Congress to support NASA. So that is why he's saying that. I would say that those of us that study this, we don't think there's really a space race going on here. For one, the United States already won the race to the moon back in 1967, or sorry, 1969. And, one country getting to the moon is not going to control the entire moon. The moon's a pretty big place. There are lots of questions about resource utilization, about how to safely coordinate activities on the moon, that we need to figure out. But there's a lot of countries that are going to be going to the moon. Whoever gets there first, second, fifth, 10th, whatever, there's going to be a lot of opportunities there. I do want to note that unlike Earth orbit, the moon is described as explicitly for peaceful purposes in the Outer Space Treaty. Military installations, military maneuvers, military exercises, and weapons testing are all explicitly prohibited under the Outer Space Treaty on the moon. And I have seen no evidence that any country is actually planning to do any of that on the moon. There's a question here from Angelica. Oh, sorry, I already got the one about the distinction there between space sustainability and space security. Space to use for peaceful purposes, could that be sort of help here in defining things? It might. The problem is there's always been different interpretations of what is meant by peaceful purposes. In fact, the original formulation of peaceful purposes was meant to include military uses of space. The original reason why the United States and the Soviet Union were interested in space was to use it for military purposes. The United States wanted to be able to use space and use satellites to collect intelligence, to take pictures of the Soviet Union, because collecting intelligence from aircraft and balloons was illegal and becoming more of a challenge as air defenses got better. If anyone remembers the 1960s, there was a US U-2 spy plane that was shot down over the Soviet Union. A guy named Gary Powers was put on trial. All of that was sort of prompting the United States to say, hey, can we use these satellites to collect intelligence, collect imagery, better understand what's going on in the Soviet Union? That was a huge driver behind the Outer Space Treaty and behind this definition of peaceful purposes. Now, peaceful purposes typically did not include aggressive uses of space. So a satellite that flew over and took pictures is non-aggressive, even if it's for the military. That has traditionally been seen by most, but not all countries, as within the peaceful purposes. A satellite firing a weapon at a place on the ground or at another satellite, that has typically not been seen as part of peaceful purposes. But this is interpretation, and there is, you know, different countries are going to interpret this differently. Question here from Marco. A different government represent a change in course with U.S. moratorium. That's possible, but I don't necessarily think it's the case. And that's because the impetus for this moratorium came from the U.S. Department of Defense. It was not imposed by the Biden administration, by the politicians. The Department of Defense proposed that the United States put in place this moratorium because they felt it was the best for U.S. national security. And that's important because the Department of Defense sort of is there regardless of who's in charge. And they've been making an argument that that this is important for the United States. The United States is one of the biggest users of space. The U.S. military relies on space. All of the debris created by this testing threatens U.S. military satellites. It creates problems. And the United States military is saying that they have other ways to accomplish their mission, then they don't need to be destroying satellites to accomplish that mission. So I hope that this moratorium will be carried through, even if there's a change in administration in the United States. And by the way, I'll point out that there's parallels here to nuclear testing. Today, there are international treaties prohibiting testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, in outer space, underwater. That all started with voluntary moratoriums put in place by the US and the Soviet Union that then evolved into legally binding treaties. So I hope that that those will be in place as well. Couple more questions. I'm sorry, Etim. I forgot to mention at the beginning. I have something else that is starting at top of the hour, so I'll need to wrap this up in the next couple of minutes here. But I do have one or maybe 3 or 4 minutes left here. So are ASAT tests the biggest source of debris at the moment? Difficult question to answer. At the moment, there's about 45,000 objects bigger than 10 centimeters that are being tracked in Earth orbit. And satellite testing has been responsible for, I think, something on the orbit of, at the moment, something about 4,000 or so of those. So the majority of debris are just satellites and rocket bodies we just left in orbit over the last 60 years, and a whole bunch of those have just exploded on their own because they had fuel left in them. So I don't think that ASAT testing is the biggest source of debris over the history, but in terms of the last 10 years, it absolutely has been the biggest source of new debris created in the last 10 years. And as far as liability, that's a big open question. States are, under the Outer Space Treaty, states are liable for their space objects, but no court case has ever been brought. There is no ICC, ICJ opinion. No country has claimed another country's satellites have caused damages to them. No one's ever invoked the liability convention for accidents in space. So this is an area of a lot of uncertainty, and no one knows how it's going to play out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weeden. I thank you so much, and I recognize the fact that we have to stop at this point because of your next engagement. Actually, there were some questions that came earlier on during the registration. Maybe I'll send you those questions. And
please do so. I'd be happy to answer them. Yep.
Yes. I thought we'd be able to help out because of your other engagement. So thanks everyone. I think we have to stop here now so that Dr. Weeden can go for his next engagement. The next webinar is coming up on March 1st, and that will be facilitated by Professor Ram Jako, and the theme that worked on the Milamos manual, that's the manual for governing military activities in space. Then finally, I also encourage us from Monday, you can start registering for the space policy course. You will see more information on the website and online. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Weeden, and we look forward to having you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, bye.